basically he was working as a consultant to the Dallas Cowboys, trying to train their quarterbacks how to play that game fast. It was claimed it was teachable, that you could, maybe as a quarterback has to take in the whole big picture, open focus mode, and see the whole picture, lock in on the receiver, and then only see the receiver and exclude everything else. So in that case, just in a matter of seconds, hopefully, fractions of a second even,
Yes.
switch modes from open, parallel, massively parallel, to tightly focused on an objective mode. So
Right.
really, that's where I see consciousness existing. It's like what it feels like to be in superposition,
Hmm.
uncollapsed waveform. Once you've decided something, then it's, I mean, consciousness in the system to me as a controls engineer is where we handle the undecidable. And so that's why I'm on the same wavelength as Roger Penrose when I say it's got to be a, a quantum process involved in all of this when it comes to consciousness. And I basically, and and within the spectrum of consciousness, I see masculine consciousness being a serially dominated mix of the two, parallel, and it's more deterministic, but it's still got to have that tension with the background. And feminine is more holistically oriented, but it's still got to have that objective center that's provided by the masculine side. So just saying we're playing with a spectrum of consciousness across the space that's one side closer to the parallel aspects of it and one side closer to the linear serial aspects of it all.
So, Jeff, welcome to Simulation. Good,
Thanks.
good to have you on. Also, really good to get connected by Ori for the
Right.
episode. Yeah. Looking forward to playing together, especially on the conversation of paradox, which is so fundamental to the nature of what this is. So, let's there's sort of two ways we can take this. We can take this in giving a bunch of context about you and how you came to where you are today, which I think is helpful. And then we can also jump straight in to paradox. You can also weave, if you'd like, yeah, the two. So why don't I'll pass it over to you and you can take over and then I'll interject as we go through.
Yeah, some go with the flow idea works pretty good, I think. But one problem I'm facing here, paradoxically, is that the language part of my brain is the opposite side from where I mostly live. Anyway, because I look at it as anyway, our I kind of feel like we are occupying a an adaptive general purpose controller, which is our neurology of our evolved neurology of our brain. And for some weird reason, it had to be split in half with specialized hemispheres. And if
Mm-hmm.
you get into it very far, there's a cleft in the brain front to back that also compartmentalizes those hemispheres more. And so my point of view from personal experience and interpretation of that experience is that I'm running on a four-cylinder paradox engine. Okay. Uh, currently, previously, I was probably running on a two-cylinder paradox engine. Uh, and the cylinders of that I would kind of throw into a Briggs-Myers context of thinking, intuition, sensing, feeling. It's like there's specialized sub-brains that we're working from that help us navigate and survive in the world from, I mean, somehow through evolutionary biology, our system has evolved to survive in the world, and there's these different modes of survival that are apparently have been discovered by evolution and is reflected in our interpretation of personality theory of what's really a pretty complex mess in our heads that, you know, to say that it's clean cut this way is asking too much. It's um, one way. I mean, for me, I started out, you know, in hindsight, being mostly running on an introverted, which is prefrontal cortex system, far as I know, thinking intuition, most dominant intuition probably system. So, and dominant intuition's kind of on the opposite side of the hardware that's processing body sense and some of the language stuff from my understanding of generalizations of cognitive, neurotypical cognitive architecture. So that's where I'm coming from, just based on my being a controls engineer by training and trying to understand how a self-tuning control system can be set up and how we can be evolved into that. And plus I played around with some tricks to move between dominance patterns. When I was around 30, I played around with some Kundalini breathing tricks that would shift hemispherical dominance, and I found that I could. And it sounded bogus to me because I'm not into that at all. But I found like that I could switch between more of the
Mm-hmm.
right dominant, which was probably my normal pattern, to more of a left dominant by using their tricks, and tried it out climbing a local mountain peak for my 31st birthday that I'd never dared do it before. And I finally figured out the reason I couldn't stand it was because my visual system was throwing these images of me falling as I tried to go up precarious trails and you know, watching other people even at heights, I would see them falling. I assume just interpret that as an evolved survival thing, more of a maternal trait than anything probably. And then by using the breathing techniques that I played around with to switch to more of a left hemisphere dominance, all that just went away, and I was just right there. Where's the next handhold? Where's the next foothold? Going up without any of that flashing into my consciousness. And so
Mm-hmm. Right.
the idea that I could move my consciousness around in the hardware
Right.
based on probably manipulating blood flow or attention
Yes. Yes.
was anyway, it made me have a different point of view of what I was and what defined me, because it's
Right.
like I was just one thing based on my natural consciousness state, but that there was all sorts of possibilities depending on where I was at in my head at the time, basically.
Right.
So, and
Which makes sense. And just want to hit the ball back and say it makes perfect sense also because the modulatory nature is also based in electromagnetic principle as well. So it makes sense that neurologically speaking, we could be talking about oxygen or glucose or blood. We could be talking about these types of things, and even more fundamentally, even more layer zero, let's say, is energy or electromagnetism, and feeling neurologically speaking, the feeling one's ability to shift between something that's tremendously logical or ordered, patterned, and something that is absolutely not that whatsoever and is has no form at all, has no logic, is totally intuitive, could be primal. There's many and there's many ways that those two things interplay, and to get really good at all of that and modulating between that, can you modulating into a sense of self and other, and then modulating out of a sense of self and other into one consciousness. So yeah, this is really fundamental. It's crucial. Yes.
I found that by playing around with that, like I took a standardized job service type dexterity test during this time I was playing around with that when I was 31 roughly. And when I was at 15, I'd had to take the exact same test, moving washers on pegs. And I got sixth percentile when I was 15. Totally introverted, totally not connected to my body. But then when I was doing this over again, I was playing around with this, and I decided I was going to become my hands for this test. And so I just put all of my attention into my hands while I performed the test, and I came in with like 96th percentile on dexterity at that point, just by becoming my hands for the dexterity test. So
Right.
really convinced me that we can change what's considered to be fixed traits or not so fixed. It's very dynamic, actually. Uh, the thing that I also found that I could put my attention by playing around with the left-right dominance. I could put myself in the middle just by intentionality with my intention system,
Yes.
and then just intuitively, I felt like somewhere in the center should be the best play. I mean, it felt like it was a good place to be. It was just sort of centered between those two
Yes.
possibilities. It seemed like that
Exactly.
was the most spacious place to
Exactly.
be. Okay, and so I played around with that. It took effort. I sort of didn't follow through forever on that. I sort of worked towards it, but uh, about 20 years later, I was trying to understand some developmental things that come about in people and get locked in early childhood, things to do with attachment system and shame and uh, probably insecure attachment style in the frame of John Bowlby. Anyway, so I said, well, shame's just a word. I want to go into shame. I want to feel it viscerally. And what is this
Right.
thing that people
Right.
are
Right.
talking about, which is, it feels like suicide to actually, anyway.
Please continue going there if you wish.
Well, all I know is I learned to be careful what you ask for. Anyway, a couple days after I did that in a safe container was an online group that I was involved in at the time. I was listening to The Universe in a Single Atom on the audiobook while I was working, which Universe in a Single Atom seems like a pretty good play on paradox, actually, to
Yes.
the book by the Dalai Lama. I just had this sudden bang, one cycle. I mean, from my engineering training, I would say it was an instantaneous shift to a different stable harmonic in the
Right.
system.
Right.
However consciousness fits together with the body, which I don't claim to have that figured out totally to the bottom, but but it happened. I mean, so now I've got this thing that I don't believe in. I've got to deal with because part of it felt like a connecting, which crossed the brain as a connecting, but it felt like a non-local connecting, like
Yes.
reconnecting with source is, or
Yes.
something. This light cloud kind of
Yes.
umbilical
Yes.
thing.
Yes. Yes.
It
Yes.
also felt like I was completing a conceptual structure that all of a sudden there'd been this discomfort or this disease that I'd been living with, and all of a sudden that was gone. It's like all of a sudden the socially conveyed model I had of the world and how things worked got reassembled into something that made sense to me finally. And there wasn't
Right.
any conceptual distress anymore,
Right.
which I'd come in the process of listening to the Dalai Lama's stuff mostly. But
Right.
anyway, and so that was
Beautiful.
made me feel like I was suddenly manic. It was pretty intense.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a few months to sort. I mean, 2 months of it was really intense, like emotionally. Like I went from thinking an intuitive dominant into a more extroverted. I was suddenly extroverted on the Briggs Myers test if I did one, where before I'd been introverted. And I was really body sense aware and emotionally off the charts from my history. And so over a period of a couple of months, I figured out how to tame that and control it and surf it, sort of. And
Yes. Yes.
since that time, I sort of weave in and out of that introverted, extroverted space, depending on what's going on in my life today.
Right.
But it got me really interested in what is consciousness? How
Right.
does this fit together? It's like,
Yeah.
what's going on here?
Right. That's the thread to pull.
And
Yeah.
it also was, there was a materialist explanation of hemispheres connecting, but it was also this thing that people talk about in religion and spirituality of reconnecting with source, which so I could have my materialist explanation, which for me is probably more comfortable, but it also had the other property too, which is one thing that got me kind of paying attention to paradox early on in that, going into that mode, if that makes sense.
Yes. I would like to ask about if you feel like the nature of shame is very directly at the root intertwined with the nature of self.
Yeah, I actually went through a journey. I've probably got 2 feet of shelf of books on shame. The immediate feeling was in that experience was shame is the root of all suffering and evil in the world. But
Right.
there's actually a centeredness between there and, I mean, so after a journey through understanding how shame is. So part of that was those experiences, and I found out from talking to other people, it is a really narcissistic surge anyway. One friend called it stink of narcissism that comes with those those shifts like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a part of shame that keeps us grounded, that we're imperfect works in progress,
Yes,
and
yes,
that's
yes.
actually beneficial and grounding and helpful. And there's the shame. There's another kind of shame that's, I mean, from an evolutionary point of view, this is an inhibitory drive that makes us conform to the social environment we're born into.
Yes. Yes.
And there's inherent cultural flaws in every system that are a problem. And the obvious one that's pretty common all over between all religions is just this maldominance of this narrative that skews society to a certain masculine bias that's really not doing us any favors at this point. The source of a lot of our cultural problems. But anyway, so I have from a system dynamics point of view, from my training, if you look at the evolution of life on the planet, there's a lot of evolution is survival of the fittest, evolution by selection, which is a slow adaptation that requires most of the way to extinction events to realign and discover how to survive in a given local environment. And it has a tendency to just go extinct. And so, and that's where you find a lot of insects, microbes, but and even the lizard brain stuff, it got to an unstable point in dinosaurs that they just went extinct. And the mammals that replaced them are a lot better at adapting in one. So there's genetics has evolved so that we can survive in a variety of environments that we adapt to in our early childhood to discover those. And if you go down the mammalian, even reptilian cycle that plays out there too. So there's adaptation in the life cycle of the individual in the early embryo, early phases of that development, adapt to the local environment, and then they're kind of locked in, which is the problem with some of the personality, what gets classified as personality disorders, but are actually good adaptation to a bad environment. Okay, you're born into a dangerous environment. You're not supposed to feel safe in that environment. Unfortunately, it's really not a happy life, but it is a survival life. I like to use cats for proxy rather than talk about people so much because it's more politically correct to talk about feral cats and how they're adapted to survive and be afraid of. I mean, they're always on edge. They're always looking for danger.
Right.
Or you've got the cat that was born in the house. It's always safe. Everything's wonderful. There's no danger. They're just all purrs and fun. And there's that possibility for adaptation is in the genetics of cats, obviously, and I'm arguing humans. Most mammals have that adaptation possibility built into them. And so rather than saying there's personality disorders in humans, there's actually just normal adaptation to the environment they were born into.
Right.
And then beyond that, we have our language and memes and memetics are a way to adapt within a mature life cycle. It's, our conditioning was tied in pretty tightly in early childhood, but we can still adapt to new environments through learning and cultural transmission with language and whatever other systems we have for higher functions. So I see that there's these different, there's been this evolution of adaptability that's been playing out, and there's not enough respect for it in society. And it's all just a work in progress. And it's not doing us any good to demonize other social orders that we don't understand. It's more a matter of being able to take different points of view based on where people are coming from and being able to sort it out in a constructive, healthy manner, which requires being able to sit in the middle between the two opposing points of view. I mean, all you have to do is
Absolutely.
look at the U.S. Congress to figure out the
Exactly.
system's broken, and taking people down to lizard brain keeps it that way.
Yes.
We need higher cognitive functions to actually sort out the problems
Right.
we've created for ourselves,
Yes.
be able to adapt to a really rapidly changing environment, if
Right.
that makes sense.
Of course. It's great hearing you weave the cosmological, evolutionary, and biological into the neurological and spiritual and deconstructive conditioning side of things, and really resonant. And yes, very simply put, um, all always has been and always will be that source light cloud, as you described. And that's part of the game of the paradox that, well, how can it be that? And how can I still feel a sense of self and separation and location? Why do I still feel location? A sense of identity that's separate from that source and whatnot. And so there's that conversation that we can go and play on. And then there's another conversation that I feel like we can play on, which is the formation. And this might actually be more, it might be better to start here and then we'll get there, which is what else is really at the root along with shame? Or what does shame, let's say, evolve into that is more easily uh, acknowledgeable, let's say, to start pulling on the thread into
Yeah.
one's subconscious? Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't really get to the point on that very well. So from a dynamics point of view, the neocortex, I feel like we're so adaptable at this point that the system is inherently unstable, and that we need intergenerational transfer to, of culture to keep the system stable. Uh, and that shame is what enforces that. And it's a survival thing, and it's important. It has its place in the system for intergenerational transfer of content that we need to learn. Okay, so it has its place. Um, I have a picture that I drew for a presentation one time that looks like a mushroom cloud.
Hmm.
And if an atomic explosion goes off, there's there's just recreation, and then there's a column that raises vertically, cylindrically. And that's how I see the individuation path going, as constrained by the cultural environment. And it it's important because without that, I would say people become I mean, there's a percentage of the population where that's the case, and those are the people we classify as psychopaths or sociopaths because they don't have that inhibition. It doesn't give them the ability to resonate with others empathically, and it's just a game. It's all just a game. They don't feel that. It feels like you're going to die if you don't conform here. They can do whatever they want, and they rise to the top of our culture because they can play. The current culture is pretty much focused on Ayn Rand type survival of the fittest is glory
Right.
point of view,
Right.
and they can do it shamelessly. They can do it
Yeah.
without worrying about hurting other people. Um,
Right.
I feel like what I experienced is that shame system, that change in topology, took the shame part offline. Like going into it and dying to the being totally transparent, nothing to worry about that way anymore, caused that system to shut down, caused all four cylinders to integrate correctly without this hierarchical enforcement of conformity playing anymore. And so then that's the top of the mushroom cloud. Basically, it's a very creative space. It's what we need for solving problems. It's what we need for be able to hold different points of view in place without having to choose between them.
Say that. Say that again. What?
Which part?
So that
The,
so that the
the sudden onset that I experienced, I mean, there's different versions of this. It can be slow or sudden, but the sudden version, I feel like it was that system dropping out. I mean, I
yeah,
confronted it head on. It
right.
dropped out, and there was just a sudden shift to another topology of consciousness that was integrating the four more horizontal aspects of interpreting reality and surviving in the world in that paradox engine point of view. So I was running on all four cylinders, and that inhibitory. There's a sounding far-fetched point of view that some people have come across point to, and that's the idea of a toroidal universe, and I would say maybe a toroidal consciousness that can only
Mhm.
be integrating so much at once, and that if it's integrating hierarchically so that we're conforming, it's integrating the autonomic nervous system inhibitory stuff that's associated with shame, that it can only pull in part of this horizontal plane that I'm just that's the four cylinders. And so it's like it just flipped an axis and the shame went away and the
Right.
other all four were integrating now. That's why I'm suddenly experiencing my body sense and my emotions so tightly, because those had been what Jungians would put in shadow.
Exactly.
It's now
Yes.
not in shadow. And it's just instantly flipped an axis and the other stuff shut down. So now I'm a functional psychopath because I don't feel shame anymore. It's like the mushroom cloud going horizontal now because it reached a certain level in the confinement. I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty good on fluid mechanics, but I still don't claim to understand the mushroom cloud all the way to the bottom. But it happens, there's this confining column that rises. It's got the energy to rise in a confined column up to a point, and then it just sort of spreads out,
Right.
and it's this inhibitory shame that's the confining space to socialize us up to a point. Once we're
Right.
socialized properly to conform in the environment we're in, then we're cut loose to do our thing creatively and explore possibilities and help society find a better way, maybe.
Interesting.
Anyway, it's a
hmm
anyway, it's
Yeah.
a work in progress, but it's my interpretation of what makes sense to me the best in the system.
I really enjoy that, and it feels good. Now, um, there are a couple things here. One of them is I would like to do a definition of shame, and it looks like the first one, when you search for it online, is very powerful. Um, a painful feeling of humiliation or distress caused by the consciousness of wrong or foolish behavior. So, would you
I have a
feel,
favorite one.
yes, please.
It's mathematical. So there's a book that was a joint project between Carl Rogers and Barry Stevens. So you got the feminine Barry's. I mean, she wrote alternating sections with Carl Rogers to try and explain his point of view in a more feminine interpretation, which was a really good book. And in there, she has a definition. It's shame is the difference between how I perceive myself to be and how I perceive society expects me to be.
Mm-hmm.
It's very concise and pretty much nails it on the head to me. It's just it's a perception of it's like what it feels like to not conform to the expectations that we feel like society expects from us. And it's totally
Mm-hmm.
subjective. It's totally from our point of view. It's not like it's necessarily actually what society expects from us, but it's how we perceive it,
Right.
how it's been transferred to us as an expectation from those around us, and mostly unspoken. A lot of it's body
Right.
language. I
Right.
mean, it's not like just rules written down in a book somewhere. Your society doesn't even follow those. I
It's
mean,
interesting because the way that you just described it is very powerful, and I love that. And then the first definition that seemed to pull up seemed to have a deep resonance with the word repentance. So,
I mean, that's one thing the Catholic Church gets right, in my opinion, is they're
yes,
confessional.
yes,
I
yes,
mean,
yes,
they get that right.
right, right. Because we could say that the core thing that we're talking about, which is, let's say, union with this source like cloud, is accessed through this style of inner work. Um, so, repentance, or in this definition, the going inward into the most painful emotions that one carries, perhaps like rocks within oneself, are some of the greatest ways, especially when some of those rocks have to do with our own immoral behavior. Uh, that's one of the best ways to transmute those rocks into the very air that they are made of. And then feel expansion and feel healing and feel space and love. And that seems to be the whole game that's being played. So that is a very powerful root. And then I like what you said too, because if I'm creating any sense of separation, I'm automatically interested in how I'm being seen or perceived because I'm localizing myself. I'm creating an illusion of a separate other. And then I'm concerned about the way that they're perceiving me.
Right.
And then that is at the root, that explodes into so many other perceptions of shame and lack and um, all different kinds of concerns and worries and anxieties and depressions and all this type of stuff. Yeah, that's powerful.
There's another aspect to this that was especially obvious to me when I had that sudden shift, and that is we all need. I mean, because of the instability in the individual, and we need feedback. We need validation. mean, as a controls engineer, obviously I like feedback. Feed forward and feedback are
Mhm.
opposites that play against each other in this paradox space. And feed forward is the genetics, a lot of it, and feedback is how we learn from our mistakes and adapt. But we talk about a lot of those early problems that have to do with shame come from invalidation. Is a very literal form of trauma.
Right.
It doesn't show bruises, but
Right.
just invalidating your worth as a person, your basic instincts to behave a certain way. There's all sorts of ways that we can be invalidated that cause a kind of trauma, and that's what the I mean. Aside from physical trauma being obvious and causing problems, there's just a. I don't think anybody escapes that kind of invalidation trauma,
Yes.
even in the best of circumstances.
Right. Yeah.
And
That's so good.
then,
One of my close friends, Sonia, recently said, "What would it look like?" This is with like teaching how to interact with, let's say, a close family. Something like, "What would it look like if you weren't constantly in an argument with who I am?" Yeah. So there's always some sort of a so much invalidation trauma happening in that regard. Like
right,
not basically not allowing uh to be what is
right.
the natural of what is. Yeah. Not allowing that. Being in an
and
argument with it. Yeah.
and Eckhart Tolle gets into stuff like that, I think, in his books and stuff. And I've come across quite a few people who've got benefit from his version of that. So I
Yes.
could probably recommend him, even though I haven't personally got into it that deep. He has this model of a pain body, and anyway, I know quite a
Right.
few people who've been helped by his books as far as an external reference.
Right.
So there's an aspect of paradox, and you touched on it in the individual versus collective, the unity versus individual separation. It's one that Mikey brought to my attention in a book from an EKG guy called The Focal Non-Focal Attention System. Well, he doesn't, he calls it open focus versus
Mhm.
focal. Anyway, so which is part of how there's where we put our attention, which is really focal attention versus the background
Yes.
that occurs in.
Yes.
So that's one place I really got into paradox.
Right. That's a very powerful entry point. It's it's also the perfect one for the localized, non-localized, which is such a
Right.
that's such a perfect one for waking up. It's such a good one. Yeah.
I have a map that I've created around a Taoist point of view that basically it's yin and yang and all the serial versus parallel modes and the space in between that. And basically, it's the space where I feel consciousness exists in different degrees. Parallel dominant versus serial dominant, and a space in between. Anyway,
Explain parallel versus serial dominant. Explain the map.
well, I mean, part of what I've done a whole presentation on was parallel learning. Uh, a good I mean, there's something in early childhood called parallel play, where basically kids watch other people play and do the same other kids play, and they imitate. It's aligned with imprinting and more of an animal domain. But a good example of it would be my oldest son when he was 3. He liked maze puzzles, and he would just bought him a whole book of maze puzzle. But he would just look at a maze and draw the answer. There
Hmm.
was no trial and error. His visual cortex was solving it without any thought processes. Just it just presented its gestalt. It's a lot of people would call it intuition, but it's really a parallel processing thing that presents the results all at once. There's no paper trail on it. We get into that in AI systems, right? And it's also, I mean, it's just how the visual cortex works. So everything's massively parallel.
Hmm.
Uh, the same son, when he got to algebra, had problems because they could present a problem to him and he could write the answer, but he couldn't show any steps in between. So
Hmm.
he had to learn how to go through the steps because they marked it wrong when they just presented the answer gestalt. But of course, algebra is all about proofs. It's got to be logical, linear. But I,
Is that serial?
that's well, all the steps in between are serial. Yeah, it's
Right.
just there's also an equivalence between serial or between parallel and rotation. I mean, I got into that in mind ventilation as a undergrad, working with one professor I worked for wanted me to prove something. Anyway, there was a way you could actually remap mind ventilation systems by using rotational elements together with translational elements, and it all separated kind of neatly. It's kind of weird. Anyway, just in mechanical engineering, there's lots of translation versus rotation stuff to deal with. Just led me to the idea that there's a basic paradox in the universe from the get-go of rotation versus translation, and in consciousness as well. It's call it masculine, feminine, or you can call it parallel or versus serial. I mean, we talk about, I mean, the Buddhists are into causality big time, which is linear causal stuff. But there's another kind of causality that's parallel, like just because you see a whole bunch of turtles popping out of the ground on the beach someplace doesn't mean it's not linearly causal, but massively parallel type. All the eggs that were laid at once are hatching at once. So just it's a different kind of causality, and we're getting lots of. I mean, Turing machines are based on linear processes, but the graphic stuff they're coming out with is massively parallel and
Hmm.
presents something that's complementary. I mean, there's a different words that fit together with paradox. Complementarity is one of them. It takes both sides to make a whole in a complementary way. Just wave particle duality. The idea that you can have something that, depending on how you look at it, comes through as a particle versus it comes through as a wave. And it can be both depending on your point of view. That's a paradox, isn't it? But
Right.
it gets described as complementarity.
Right.
And to me, it's
So,
probably a local versus focal, or a focal versus non-focal kind of paradox at play.
right. Right. So, one of the ways to look at this, and for those listening on audio, I would recommend also checking out the video version where this is embedded. So, is that the complementality. How did it
Complementarity.
complementarity?
Right.
Yes, complementarity. The simultaneity, the um, the both and neither, the all of that um, is the middle or is the whole thing. And then one of the best ways to describe the indescribable is through this paradoxical viewing of it.
So paradox and ineffable are probably tightly related.
Yes, yes, right.
Is another word that comes up. And there's another aspect to this that has to do with Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which is decidability. And there's a boundary between the computable and the rest of the universe. I mean, whenever we try and objectify everything, there's a limit that what can be objectified and what can be computed by a Turing machine. And there's a territory to explore in that direction. Probably falls under the word oracles.
Continue.
Uh, and and really, that's where I see consciousness existing. It's like what it feels like to be in superposition,
Hmm.
uncollapsed waveform. Once you've decided something, then I mean, consciousness in the system to me, as a controls engineer, is where we handle the undecidable. And so that's why I'm on the same wavelength as Roger Penrose when I say it's got to be a, a quantum process involved in all of this when it comes to consciousness. And I basically, and within the spectrum of consciousness, I see masculine consciousness being a serially dominated mix of the two, parallel and it's more deterministic, but it's still got to have that tension with the background. And feminine is more holistically oriented, but it's still got to have that objective center that's provided by the masculine side. So just saying we're playing with a spectrum of consciousness across the space that's one side closer to the parallel aspects of it and one side closer to the linear serial aspects of it all.
Right.
Anyone?
Right. And the nice thing about being very malleable in one's modulatory ability is to not box oneself into category and therefore to be boxless and to be able to navigate into what can be more parallel or more serial and call upon frequencies of those domains as is in flow.
The one book I got into by Les Femhe on the open focus brain was basically he was working as a consultant to the Dallas Cowboys, trying to train their quarterbacks how to play that game fast. It was, claimed it was teachable that you could maybe as a quarterback has to take in the whole big picture, open focus mode, and see the whole picture, lock in on a receiver, and then only see the receiver and exclude everything else. So in that case, just in a matter of seconds, hopefully, fractions of a second even,
Yes.
switch modes from open, parallel, massively parallel to tightly focused on objective mode. So
Right.
okay,
That's great that you bring up sport. It's one of the best analogies, it feels like, and so relatable to so many.
right.
Uh, it is really the simultaneity of taking in the whole while also being able to focalize on the specific thing that needs to happen at that time. And it's really, really beautiful. It's like also it's very relatable, even if one didn't necessarily go really hard in playing sports in one's life. So many people are fans of sport.
Right.
So therefore, when you're a fan of sport, you can also see this happening where you're taking in the whole of the field or the court or both teams and etc. And then at the same time the field. And then at the same time, you're honed in on where's the ball right now? Who is around the ball? Where's the ball moving? And uh, that's one of the best. Yeah, it's a really good analogy. Yeah.
One of the things that he brings up in that book is he says from an evolutionary point of view, it's the lioness on the hunt, taking in a herd of gazelles or whatever, and then having to lock in on one specific target and take it down, and being able to focus on one is important for survival. But also, it's tied in with the sympathetic nervous system for the attack mode. And so, by being in focal mode a lot, we're also in sympathetic activation. If I mean, I don't know
Hmm.
how everybody relates to that term, but from
Hmm.
in the autonomic nervous system, there's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic axis of that, and the sympathetic axis is what's getting us in trouble in our culture, mental
Right.
health wise and physiological health wise, and it's because anything that uses focal attention is sort of brings along with it some level of activation, which is
Yes.
partly just looking at a screen in front of you with your focal
Right.
attention system takes you there to some extent.
It
Anyway, so
totally
it's
does. It
yeah, that's
totally
like,
does.
and which brings us
Yes.
to another word for paradox, which is a catch-22 for whoever's familiar with movie versions of paradox.
Oh man.
If you look at
So this
linear,
is interesting. We could even say that the the most seemingly uh, distorted part of the perfection is the over focalization, which is
right?
also the most beautiful part of it at the same time.
Well, if you talk about getting out on a vista and being in awe and wonder at the big picture, that's sort of the antidote to it a little bit.
Yeah,
Uh,
really bringing
one
you to
thing,
your knees, really
yeah,
bringing you to your knees in awe of the beauty, because it's both the most distorted, like the veil of separation being the very edge of the attractor of Maya, and it being also the most beautiful aspect of creation is God totally forgetting itself in its illusion. Yeah, so good.
I was going to mention it's part of the idea of paradox is that as soon as things become self-referential, like in object language, the sentence, all you have to do to create a paradox with language is to make it self-referential. So I make the statement, this sentence is untrue, or this sentence is a lie, this statement is a lie. By the time it becomes self-referential, it's really easy to create a paradox, a logical paradox, because if the statement's true, it's false, and if it's false, it's true. Problem. It doesn't take much to do. Is once it becomes self-referential, and our consciousness is really self-referential. I mean, being aware of ourselves and what we're experiencing is a very self-referential process. So it's not, shouldn't be too surprising that it would be in that space of paradox.
Right.
I mean, and then paradox doesn't have to be two choices. It can be a whole spectrum of choices. Which is one thing that got me into this mess in the first place, was trying to understand black and white thinking and
Mm-hmm.
how that can be, versus being able to see the gray areas in between. And being able to see the gray areas is being able to handle paradox, basically. It
Right.
doesn't have to be black or white. It can be all these other choices in between. You can even have colors. So it's what makes our reality so interesting and complicated mess.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully fun.
It's unbelievably fun. Yeah. Yeah, it's very indescribable, ineffable, paradoxical, superpositioned. It's very interesting because even the superposition, it's almost yeah, it's a way to say all of it, and none of it. And that's kind of the end of it. And uh, uh and then it feels really good. It feels really good. It should feel really good. Um, because one should feel very final. One should feel very complete. One should feel uh, very empty of their own conditioning and empty of their own sense of self and empty of their own narrative and their own story. It should feel more and more like a clear vessel and a clear channel for whatever reflectiveness the collective is seeking for their own healing and awakening. And that it's a whole different existence that is harmonically chiming the body. It's a whole different feeling. Um, it's really finding what was never lost. Yeah.
So there's a paradox in the interpretations of non-duality. Uh, one being, yeah, being in the now idea, but I would contrast that with a sense of detachment. Like there's also a meta observer detached point of view from the now. It makes the good, the bad, and the ugly tolerable from
Yeah.
that, because you're not, I mean, there's a space that's created in non-duality that is just a little bit removed from the intensity of it, and it might take a while to get there through. Well, anyway, there's two aspects to what gets thrown in there to me as one idea in the mystical experience domain or non-dual domain.
Right. You could say that the it expresses itself in where there's an absolute transcendent spaciousness, and at the same time, there's an absolute feeling of totally everything. And yeah,
So, but one aspect of it just gives some space to come up with new ideas. I think it's a creative. It's less tightly bounded by what's allowed, and so you get
yeah,
all these divergent behaviors coming out of
yes,
people that tend to get them locked up sometimes. It's like,
right,
yeah,
right,
and then there's a conditioning that people bring to those experiences that comes up with all sorts of different points of view that are kind of all the same thing, but I think. I mean, like if you look at the history of the Mormon religion where I grew up, there was a column of light and God appeared before Joseph Smith and blessed him to be keeper of the priesthood and some things like that that conformed with his training up to that point in time, his expectation. There's an expectation component to it, I guess, based on our prior conditioning. And what I brought to experience was radical agnosticism, probably. So that's still where I'm at, pretty much, with the paradox thing. Hasn't really changed. Whatever I was conditioned to before is still my condition.
right.
I think those those shifts change. So there's the idea of qualia comes in for me. I mean, didn't really think about it too much till
Yes,
I got going to hanging out with Dave Chalmers and Science of Consciousness. But I've come to the point where I view qualia as like a natural language encoded in our genetics. And if you look
right,
at what smells good to me versus what smells good to a fly, obviously they are like oppositely encoded. The fly likes things decomposing, smelling like shit, and I don't, and I'm repulsed by it. And somehow in the genome, there's probably encoding for that. Somehow it comes into play. And so it's like our body and our genetic code has this built-in language that tells us how we're supposed to feel about things, and that basically all of our conscious experiences is just built with qualia, but it's just like how it's pixelated. It's kind of my point of view on this, and it's there might be a possibility to break that code,
hmm,
probably in a Euler number space if I it was my intuition about it, but somehow or other we interpret our body interprets the world for us, builds this reality, maintains this reality in a hologram that's pixelated with qualia.
right,
And how that, and so somehow there's a language there that I feel like we have some hope of
yeah,
understanding better. At the very least, we could map that better. The stuff I come across is pretty broad brush on mapping with it. There's all sorts of different flavors of pain, for instance, or pleasure, or color, or what's the quality of feeling right about something. I mean, feeling like you know the right, you're sure of yourself is got to be some
hmm,
kind of a quality of mapping. And I think there's a lot of unexplored territory in that direction. Sometimes I think about how to build synthetic consciousness and conscious. I mean, I kind of see us as biological meat robots, and we're being programmed by our conscious experience. And if we're growing up in this dangerous environment and we're afraid of everything or fight or flight most of the time, then that's all being encoded in our neurology to become subconscious, and we're navigating that with consciousness and solving the problems. And after it becomes routine, then it's just encoded in the neurology and reduced to subconscious processes. Doesn't require if it's computable, it doesn't require consciousness anymore. Consciousness is where we're navigating it. What's not computable. Clearly deterministic. Anyway.
Yeah, there's a certain quality of relaxation. Yeah. Really, that peace and relaxation, space. Yeah. Really, that sort of like vacuuming away of self back into the void and the source. And then whatever is left, which can be some occasional fabrications of self, but then even that is more slightly subtly deconditioned and unwound, and just greater and greater peace, love, space, all of that, like the ability to relax and not do anything and feel the absolute perfection that everything is the most unrecognizable skill. Um, and like, what is the quality of that? What is the internal subjective experience of it? Because it really, it feels like divinity. It feels like crying because everything's so perfect and you're not doing anything. So everything is automatically worthy and love. And it's all this type of, what are those emotions? What are those feelings that are coming up? Um, and then, yeah, how would we go about, how would we go about mapping that, and at the same time then having that urge of, oh, my bladder is full now, I was using the bathroom, or now I'm thirsty and so now I'm going to go drink some water, or I'm hungry so now I eat some food, and etc. And how are we architecting out, because this is another core thing about realization, is that mind creates reality. So whatever is leaving right here, uh, that is creating reality. So if what is leaving is oriented around what is existing now, we're basically talking about the past. So only by talking about the highest ideal possible, just as an example, heaven on earth, or whatever abundant, prosperous civilization you want for children and grandchildren to revel in for millennia, only by holding that in your heart, in your gut, in the deepest parts of you, and being unmovable or unshakable from that, can that actually manifest. It's the only way it can manifest, because otherwise the same trigger will come up about some sort of a political conversation, and before you know it, there'll be arguments and all this type of stuff. So the only role you have is to constantly be immovable in heaven on earth. And what does that feel like? What does it feel like to know without a shadow of a doubt that that is what this is meant to do here?
Yeah, for me, I think it's really important to be able to be at peace with where things are now, both within ourselves and within the society we exist in. And it takes a little bit of detachment to do that, I think, especially with society. But I mean, one argument I play around with is, there's lots of, I mean, the valley where I live has been the site of multiple utopian experiments over its since white men drove the Indians out, basically, to set up their utopias here, and it hasn't played out well so far. But there's that desire to come up with a better system, and and in the current environment, there's a really strong, what I would call wonderful family syndrome, where everything's got to be wonderful, or it's just not worth it. And and so your ideal is, okay, everything's wonderful, nothing ever goes wrong, and then I die. Is that really a wonderful life? Or would it, you really want to get drugged through the muck and overcome something and do something meaningful? And then is that what's a wonderful life, you know?
Right.
A lot of people aspire to the idea that life should just be easy and wonderful, a utopian ideal, everything, never a crossword, and have cousins who grew up in an approximation to that, and they have not fared well in life past their immediate house of origin because they weren't prepared for the real world very well. And so there's one thing I get into is just how adaptive filtering works in our brains, and obvious to me is that our brains are conditioned by, or a lot of it's driven by expectations. What we see is what we're expecting to see. It's an anticipatory biased filter. And if we've grown up in a very safe environment, like with the cats, we have an expectation that that's what we're going to see. And if we have grown up in a violent, unsafe and house, then that's what we expect to see. And it's a self-fulfilling expectation. It's like there's almost a mind blindness to things that we aren't expecting to see. Because there's a story, I don't know if it's true or not, of Captain Cook sailing into a harbor where there were Aborigines in Australia, and they were just out there in their fishing boats with this big sailing ship coming into their harbor, and they weren't even paying any attention to it because they didn't have any context for it. And at some point, they saw a man on the deck, and all of a sudden they realized, oh, here's a contact. That's a person. We got to get out of here. This is a big bad thing coming at us. And so, and I think with what we're doing with AI these days, it's easier to understand how that works, because if you've got an AI that's programmed with a certain database, then it's going to find things that fit in that database. And if it's outside that, it's not going to see it. And our brains work that way more than we would like to acknowledge. And it's definitely trying to tease the most out of a noisy signal by looking for based on its past history, anticipating what it's going to find, and then confirming that when it's with the least amount of data to confirm it. But it gets us in trouble. Some people get in trouble because they're just expecting the worst from everybody, and so they'll interpret a neutral situation to be a bad situation, and other people will see the neutral situation and see it to be good, and they'll get taken to the cleaners by fraudsters. So
What you said earlier is really powerful, which is that uh, who is to say that the experience uh, of taking birth into an abundant and prosperous civilization of only positive qualia is a better um, feeling of infinity than a feeling of infinity that gets extremely contracted in trauma and then liberates itself from the illusion or does not and just continues into a negative qualia for its experience. And that's a very powerful question. And it's also part of the simplicity of things like the prismatic refraction of light, or the color palette, um, that yeah, that there's no compartmentalization of the best and then the guiding of it towards what is quote best. Um, and yet at the same time, there uh, there is the recognition that there was tremendous trauma that this collective has been through, and that uh, if one would like to entertain some story or idea or concept or narrative about infinity and its exploration, it could very much be that this is one of the uh, deepest, darkest, traumatic experiences it's gone through, with forgetting itself and then waking back up to remember itself and to build a prosperous playground for itself here on Earth for millennia to come. And that's some funny ass narrative that we tell ourselves. Um, and uh, Yeah, and it's up to whatever you feel, really. It's really up to whatever you feel. If you feel like you want to promulgate continuous transgenerational traumas under the excitement of creating more suffering to then create greater liberation or not, go for it. If you want to end that, if you want to create abundance where children are born into abundant water, food, and energy infrastructures that enable them to and be taught and still be taught, let's say, hypothetically, still be taught about suffering and still be taught about a sense of self and still be taught about shame and about these core root emotion that they don't necessarily get as contractive an experience with. If that if that fancies you, then perhaps that's what fancies you, and you want to build something like that where they can play more, where you can play more freely, continually. So it's all a very interesting color palette and explosion of whatever you say goes. There's nobody else here but you. Whatever you say goes, fam. Yeah.
Well, I don't think we're in danger of paradise descending upon us anytime soon, so I don't spend a lot on that one, but there's plenty to work with there.
There's plenty
Keep
to work.
reminding people of that. You got lots. Yeah, would you? So just if you want to complain about the world, well, that's just an opportunity. Go for it. You know, I don't think we're out of opportunities anytime soon. And one thing I've noticed in my lifetime is when I was young, there was lots of just survival from material needs point of view played into the
Right.
equation, and
Right.
yeah, and there wasn't helicopter parenting and stuff like that going on. And in a couple generations, that whole picture is like kids get everything handed to them, and yet they're stressed. It's like there's almost this balancing act between material needs versus mental, emotional needs. As the material needs become just handed to people, it's like it ramps up the emotional trauma for some reason, or makes people more insecure, makes life less meaningful. And I think that's probably a trauma in itself too. And a lot of people are having a crisis of what makes life worth living. You know? And when you're just fighting to meet your basic needs, you don't have to worry about that. It's like my buddy Gino says that's a first world problem versus a third world problem. There's some reality to that.
Yes.
And so, but there's still problems
Gino.
at every level. It seems like they evolve and take on new forms. I don't know. I mean, from my point of view, I see pretty much a never-ending challenge just from the environment and dealing with planetary issues that we've got to deal with. If not that, then maybe ways to move off the planet and do things off the planet and the challenges that will provide. And there's always plenty of chaos to be interjected in the physical system, so there will always be that to deal with, navigate. So
Right.
I'm not worried about running out of things to
Yeah.
deal with
Yes.
on the negative side.
And I like how this also circles us to the more that we can hold the whole at the same time as enjoy the focal, the non-focal at the same time as focal. Yeah, it really just brings so much more just flowfulness and peace, love, um, and greater clarity in what is actually going on. Um, and then enable us, equip us better to understand what's going on, and then help shepherd whatever we want, if we want more abundance or however we see things, however we want.
I mean, there's plenty of challenge to be faced in just shifting to a balancing out masculine versus feminine in our environment.
Right,
That's many generation project, I assume.
right.
It's
One of there's a,
been going on for a lot of generations up to now, and it's still not dealt with.
wow, there's such a good access point, it feels like, for the male bodies to learn the feminine. There's a really good access point that it feels like is in the root chakra, if you will. And it's something that I feel like I'll be making more content about, but that when the male also learns, when the male body also learns how to let go of the contracted energy around its own root, it can then learn how to close that loop on itself, that torus loop. When this opens up, it can more easily close that toroidal loop, and then also understand what it's like to be the receptive, which is the feminine female body, if you will, and receive rather than contract and close, but like learn how to receive. Um, yeah, there's that, and then it shows up in such simple ways. Also, just those that won't even receive a that struggle to receive even a simple gift of some sort. Very simple. Hey, you want to just relax a bit, honey, while I go and make some tea or whatever it is. Like, just no, I'll do it myself.
Yes. Yeah, but a lot of people have trouble with that.
Trouble with receiving.
Trouble with
Trouble.
receiving, yes.
Learning that is an art. Yeah.
A work in progress. Lots of things are work in progress.
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of my worldview. Is God's got to be a work in progress if you want to objectify God somehow, which is dangerous territory. It's
Yeah.
more like the whole thing's a creative process and it's all a work in progress.
Yeah. The ultimate painter forever painting. Yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of great uh topics that we covered, and I really, really, really enjoyed the conversation. I really
Me
did.
too.
I love hearing that.
Like
And I feel like there's so much to still uh, play on together, which is really exciting. Again, I'm really grateful for Ori pointing this out. I knew as soon as he pointed it out that I was excited about it because it's very rare that he does, and then when he does, I know that it's important. And more of the conversations that I have on the show are of this caliber, which is really exciting. And it also leads to what I feel like is more and more osmosis between uh, whatever lattices and energies are happening here, and then that can serve, yeah, better. And it's just really exciting, Jeff. I really appreciate you, and I appreciate the worldview that you have, and I look forward to potentially continued conversations. Yeah.
I do too. I think what you're describing there is some parallel processes we don't have very good language for yet. I think are totally unappreciated, and definitely from the feminine side.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yes. Yes. That's so good. So, Jeff, what would be the best place for people to check out more of you?
that's a hard question because there aren't too many. But I've done presentations at different meetings that I've got a little bit of it available online. Not a lot. I could put more pretty easily. I've got a web address at paradigmsofcreativity.com that there's a little bit up on. And I have some presentations that I could put links up if I figure out how to do it. A little bit tech challenged on some of the web stuff, but anyway.
So
Uh,
we'll we'll maybe have some of this in the description for people to go and check out.
okay, yeah, they could put up some more stuff or put some links on.
Yeah, and perhaps that's also something that we can, yeah, help is get the content up and help with that. Yeah.
Supposed to be working on a writing project that isn't very far into it yet. I wanted to do a book project around like a self-user's guide for conscious robots, and maybe at some point I'll get ambitious on that better than I have so far. Basically, write a substrate independent user's manual for conscious agents. It brings in some of the essential hardware for survival in a evolutionary environment, survival of the fittest environment. It might be universal across either biological or non-biological ways that could be implemented. But interesting, anyway, just a way to play around with some of this stuff. Something that would be a work in progress. Ideally, you can put in additional updates and sections as they become more well defined.
Right.
Like some of the stuff we've worked with in an industrial environment where there's constant updates being issued on what's the best way to address a certain problem. Anyway,
Yep. Right.
someday, maybe.
Right. Well, it feels like that's coming through as a mycelial network. That's coming through, which is great. Yeah, and it will help us heal. Yeah. So excellent. And then also, thank you everybody also for tuning in. We're very grateful that you joined us, and would love to hear from you in the comments below also. So drop us a comment with how you felt, what resonated, what didn't, that kind of stuff. Why? Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Also share it with people that you feel like this would resonate with if you would like to. And to check out all of Jeff's links. Also check out our links. The most exciting projects are available on the websites below, especially Home DAO, which is helping us make the shift into the higher awareness communities and having the basic needs infrastructures be met across Earth. And that's it. I'm really looking forward to continued play together, Jeff.
Me too.
Excellent.
We've got more we could cover.
Same. Yeah. Yeah. Let's all end the recording and then we'll stay in here for a little bit longer. All right. Bye everyone.
But